What's going on, fishy friends? It is hard to believe it, but this is season 6 of the Crazyhorse Fishing Hour.
Mm-hmm.
I would tell everyone at home to go back and watch those earlier seasons, but this was all much darker.
Oh my gosh. It has nothing to do with the content, but everything to do with his beard.
This was all much darker in season 1. And I didn't have a lovely co-host in season 1. Speaking of a lovely co-host, how are you tonight?
I'm good.
Yeah?
Yeah. Had some healthy dinner tonight. I'm hyped. Ready to go. Let's do this.
Well, I mean, this show has grown. We've grown in crew members, but we weren't always live. We used to do it from my basement at a bar that I had in my basement. It's a much more family-friendly approach now. But we've also grown in, the stature of our guest. I mean, I've been following our guest tonight for a very long time. Chris Bush of the Speckled Truth.
Mm-hmm.
Lady C and I both love chasing speckled trout here on the Chesapeake Bay.
Yes, it's fun. Good sport fish.
And Chris has a fantastic podcast, The Speckled Truth. He's got a great story. We're not going to get into that. We're not going to get into that too much. I will leave that for you. But we're excited to bring Chris Bush on tonight. We've got a lot of great guests coming up.
Mm-hmm.
We have Kevin Conroy, who's going to be representing Hummingbird. He's going to show us all how to read a sonar.
And so much more.
We have Vince Noble, former ESPN.
ESPN announcer, gone movie producer, gone Gator charterman.
Mm-hmm. Who else do we have coming up on the?
Our list is so long. We have Bob Pino from Hook Optics.
Yep. Yep.
Maybe a cameo with Mrs. Pino in there too.
Maybe.
Yeah.
We've got Carl Ward joining us here in the studio.
What's up?
But all of that is really awesome. Lady C and I will be at the Kent Island Fishermen's Club at the end of this month. Mm-hmm. What are we doing there, Lady C?
Oh, we're going to be doing amazing interviews from people we're not going to mention right now because it's really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So some of our local favorites and then some.
I think we should bring them
up. The show.
We should give them some.
You want to?
Yeah, we got to give them a reason to show up.
Spill the beans.
They're going to want to come see you regardless.
Sure.
But Walleye Pete will be there. Jamie Clow's going to be there.
Eddie Weber,
the Severn River angler. Robert Lombardi.
Bob and Nikki Pino.
We're going to have a nice bunch of folks there.
Yep. We're going to be selling our shirts.
Yeah.
For men and women.
These amazing threads will be available.
Yep. So. Selling, what's we selling?
Oh, Hook Optics.
Hook Optics.
We'll be selling sunglasses.
Yes. You get to try them on and pick out your pair of Hook Optics with us. That's cool, right?
Yeah. So before I spill any more beans, why don't you tell us about who's coming on?
Yes. So the Speckled Truth. Chris is going to be with us tonight. I'm super excited for many reasons. One, he's former military. I mean, it's like we're all former military here on the show.
Do you want to bring him in so we're talking about him?
No, I want to introduce him because not everybody knows him. And I always say this, shame on you for not knowing who this person is. Just an amazing man. He's an avid angler. He is known for his podcasts. Also for his articles and blogs. I read a couple today. It was really good. And catching these mammoth-sized trophy speckled trout.
I mean, we were going to have him on a while ago, and he was like, you know what? I just catch too many 30-inch trout. I'm just kind of not feeling it right now.
I just don't think we were ready for him just yet.
He's laughing back there.
I love the background.
But seriously, Chris, how many 30-inch trout have you caught? Let's just dive right into that.
Sure. Been blessed to catch 5 in my life and have come close a number of times. And that's notable because in this game, and I talk about it a lot, is that you can never round up. So there's two two statuses that you can't round up, and that's a double-digit trout and a 30-inch trout. So I've been blessed to catch 5.
Right on.
My goodness, I've never even seen a 30-incher, but I do know this about speckled trout. Something happens when they hit about 22, 23 inches where they just get girthy, and you can really tell what's on the end of your line. You know, they pull a lot harder at that size too.
Yeah. It's funny because, and that's what I love about this game, is when I take friends or folks that are kind of getting into it, and I don't charter. I have a very actually close circle of anglers that I've fished alongside. But the few friends that I've had that were kind of getting and diving into it, even to include my dad, and I think we'll talk about my pops here in a bit, but really, when they hook a big trout for the first time, to some extent, we're talking 25, 26, even upper 20-inch fish. They almost always say, it's a redfish, because of the strength and in their uncharacteristic ability to kind of pull hard, right? They're known as kind of a fragile fish, especially when they're smaller. But when they get big, they get really savage and they get really angry, and they get actually really strong. And so, unlike redfish, they streak a lot. They go side to side really quickly. They change direction. And redfish are kind of just more of these brute, kind of by force. And so there's a lot of intricacies and skill, even fighting a large trout, because it seems that they have so many tricks up their sleeve. But to your point, when they do get big, it's almost always intuitive that once a person who's inexperienced goes, it's a redfish, and I'm like, let's hold on for a second, and let's just positively ID it. And almost always they're like, I never would have thought.
For sure. But before we get too deep,
sorry,
because we can talk about this all night. I really can. It's just amazing. I'd like to remind the audience that we're going to be doing question of the evening tonight. And Chris is graciously going to award the winner with, what do you have, Chris?
Yeah, so it's, well, like I was saying, it's a box of, we used to give them out for our Dirty 30 citation program, but basically it's going to be a From Texas with Love box of really Texas coastal brands geared towards targeting big fish, i.e. custom corky, Texas custom lures and double Ds. So you'll see custom, or Fat Boy corkies and double Ds and mirror lure, and some soft plastic brands, again, local to the South Texas fishery. So that'll be From Texas with Love to whoever the lucky recipient is.
That's exciting.
And we both know your podcast really well, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. But we've listened to it enough to know, Chris, that you're very knowledgeable of the speckled trout, from Texas all the way up to its Virginia. Northern reaches here, where we are in Maryland. So I think you're well aware that this package that you're putting together would be effective for targeting trout in many more areas than just Texas.
For sure.
Yeah, and that's what's been really cool to kind of interface with so many folks through the virtual landscape that follow us from Virginia, obviously all the way down here, is that, and that's what's been really fun to see, is to see the corky fat boy kind of take precedence, or at least have a place in the North Carolina, Virginia fisheries, and people having really a lot of success on that bait. That's really a Texas-born, tried and true. That's the pride of Texas bait here, made by Mr. Paul Brown, and so it's cool to see that those work different states and different regions and kind of across state lines.
They sure do.
Mm-hmm.
Sure do.
Well, I'd like to give the audience a chance to know you. Again, shame on them for not knowing you if they don't. But I'd like to, if you can share with us, a little bit about your how I got into fishing story. What do you enjoy about fishing and what's important to you? And you talked to me before the show, and you mentioned a lot about the influence of your family in there, and how does that play into, how is it that you're so passionate today about fishing?
And I mean, you just said family, and immediately kind of choke up because no, seriously, I mean, that's I share the story at all the different speaking engagements that I've been, man, blessed enough to be invited to do. And I really do bring it back to just this love. And I was actually just talking to Rob Phillips from Hook and Bullet Sunglasses, and it really boils down to I love this fishery and all that it's given to me, in participating in this fishery and in all these different things. And I will say the root of it is because at a very young age, like I was telling you, Anastasia, was like, man, I was truly kind of brought up in this fishery. My dad's a notable trophy, I say trophy trout, a notable speckled trout angler in the Louisiana estuary, and mainly for numbers, but he did a lot of tag and release stuff. But that man, and really our family, um, he's always kind of preached three things, and it's God, family, and fishing, and in that order, son. And I've always kind of kept that close hold. And if it gives you an idea of in terms of priorities in our life, it's always been that way. And it's not just fishing, but speckled trout fishing. And so when you talk about speckled trout fishing, there's an innate, um, immediately kind of I think about my dad, and the experiences that we've had in the water. And, from when I was a young boy and catching either the first trout that I've ever caught in Lafitte, Louisiana. So I'm from Louisiana, to, a big fish that he's caught here, and understanding the emotion and the transcendent emotion from him as a father, coaching me through and teaching me how to fish and love this fishery. And then, 30 years later, here I am in the Texas flats, not even our home waters, and watching my dad catch, the biggest fish of his life, and the emotion that he had, and the hugs that we've embraced, and those things. And that's why family and speckled trout fishing is so synonymous. And that's really the root of why I love this fishery and what we do in terms of speckled truth, So, um, yeah, born and raised South Louisiana, pops a huge influence, and joined the military. Anastasia, I know you were kind of, mentioning that as well, but that was post 9/11. And so the ability, Grant, you were talking about as well, which was, um, really getting back to the ability with my military career is being able to fish all these different fisheries. So I've fished South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, West Coast, Florida, East Coast, Panhandle, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and now Texas. So many of the estuaries that have trout, I've been able to fish those. But it all comes back down to the foundation that was established there in South Louisiana. So with my dad, so yeah. And then lastly, I'm sorry, Anastasia, your question with regards to approach. Yeah, we teach conservation. As you see, I'm very animated and passionate about kind of our fishery. I think about it. And as we were talking last night, I was sharing, what we try to do through written word, through video, through the podcasts and stories of old timers, or even from younger guides and people that participate in the resource. The intent there is for folks to understand the value of a fishery, and that it truly is more than just a bag of fillets. It truly is more than just a fish. It means so much to so many people. And when you can make that connection from the bend of a rod, and as you mentioned yesterday, the transcend of a bend of a rod to the actual fish itself. And then once you catch that fish, hold, release, there's no greater feeling. And now you've kind of, gotten, to that person's heart. You've touched their life. And so now we've recruited the right type of angler, who participates in the fishery the right way. And that's what we're trying to get after with Speckled Truth is, yeah, we share tips and techniques. We want you to be successful. There's zero jealousy. We want you to be successful. But at the end of it is we also want you to make sure that we have a sustainable fishery for the long term.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I want to pause right there. And I just want to, I do coaching and counseling, and I had some training last night. We talked about the power of pausing, because what you said was, I got goosebumps. People know how I am on the show. And when you are sharing the depth of the experience of fishing and family and how that connects and even transcends the rod, it's beautiful poetry, what you just said. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think it's also, it's valuable, the experience that you shared where, you know, your father sort of passed this down to you, and now you're passing it down to another
Three boys. Yeah.
generation of anglers. We have a you know, an agenda that we've gone over with you, you know, already, but we've always made it a priority to address the questions that come in from our audience, and the audience is I guess very curious to
Got a lot of questions.
pick your ear about some stuff. So we're gonna go ahead and throw some questions in now.
Okay.
This is from Sam from Outdoors in Maryland. He says, "What conditions are you looking for to target either trout or reds?"
Well, redfish, I couldn't tell you because I don't do that, and so and have no hard feelings for those who do. But for those you know, seeking to target a big fish or an opportunity at a big fish, man, it really depends, right? That's going to be an answer you hear a lot tonight. And but if I had to cherry pick conditions, it's certainly prefrontal, overcast, to some extent pretty cold. So like this time of year is really my absolute favorite. And obviously we're here in South Texas, where water temps are kind of typically in the 60s, right? We got down into the 40s with, you know, the last little cold snap that we had. But I really like upper 50s, 55 to 62-degree range. Again, middle of winter-ish, cold, overcast day, certainly low light conditions. I actually like a lot, to some extent, I say a lot of wind. I like some wind. I like water clarity. Let me phrase that, lack of water clarity. So a lot of people like some clean water.
Really?
I like a fairly stained water column. And it's mainly because, again, these fish are not stupid. They really, you give yourself an upper edge because now you've presented something where it might break up that profile just a little bit. Maybe they see a flash or a color hint. And so now they basically, they're trying to trust their intuition and instinct, but they can't quite resist enough. And that's the mistake. That's the one slip we're looking for them to make when we're targeting. And it's that slim, right? It's that slim margin that we're looking to take advantage of. And so those are the conditions that I like.
Wow. Yeah. I'll just jump in really quick. And I think my favorite thing about this show is that it allows me to continue learning all the time. And like, you know, anything about speckled trout, Chris, I'm going to listen to you. Yeah. But like, honestly, what we talk about up here on the Chesapeake is we need the cleanest water possible.
Sure.
But that's a really interesting take that you just shared.
No, it's true.
Yeah, and it's not to say that you can't catch them in clean water, right? I've done that actually all winter so far. This year, more than years past, we've had ridiculously clean waters in the part of the estuary that I fish, and so I've had to adapt, right? And part of that adaptation is really with bait profile, also to understanding how those fish relate to different contours and ledges, right? And so where I would previously catch them when typically we'd have, you know, a little bit of an off color water, understanding that there's other structure in the area, and with cleaner water, understanding potentially their patterns, right? So in lower light conditions, maybe they are coming out and making themselves a little bit more susceptible in shallow, clean water, like air clear water. And then as the sun gets high, or at least as, you know, as we get into the day and there's a lot more light, those fish potentially pull off on that kind of secondary structure, where as if you had a typically stained column, they might sit up there all day. And it's not because they feel uncomfortable potentially. That could be part of it, but it also could be too that the bait is uncomfortable sitting exposed in super clear water in the shallows. And so now those fish have just kind of obviously adapted and have fallen off, because that's kind of what the bait's doing, right? And so it's little things like that. So yeah, if I had to cherry pick a day in those conditions, that would be it, because I've had success in that. But it's not to say you can catch them in dirty water, which I've done that. And it's not to say you can't catch them in air clear water. I've done that. So the spectrum is wide. And that's why, again, I go back to, it depends is pretty much probably acceptable for most questions, because there's so many nuances to every situation.
So true. We talk about that all the time, the different variables that are involved in fishing. It's not always so clear cut.
Oh, there's always seems like a million. And I used to really try to break down the variables. Now I'm just like, you know what? I'm just going to go fish.
There you go.
You know, because I think I personally overthink it sometimes.
Yeah. So, you know, you mentioned about education, and, you know, that's one of our goals as the Fishing Channel, is to help educate. And that's why we appreciate people like you coming on the show, because you have such a wealth of just diverse knowledge. And, you know, it's speaking of, you know, the names of our show and you being the Speckled Truth. Can you tell us a little bit about what's the mission? What are the goals with the Speckled Truth?
Sure. So it started as a blog. And so I started writing back in 2013, and it was really just a creative outlet for me to get there. As it's continued to grow, really our mission, I guess, is to, it's really to develop people as anglers. It is to, you know, help them grow as sportsmen. And we want to do that through like captivating and capturing like story, either through written word or again through picture, right? And so that's kind of how we do that. But at the end of it is our goal is we want people to develop as basically conservationists. Now, what we do, and kind of like, if you would, you know, explain Speckled Truth in a nutshell, in a very, very short nutshell, is really now we are a brand. So I'm an actual LLC. And I'll share that here in a sec, but we're a brand that basically links life and pursuit of trophy speckled trout. So fish in the fishing industry, there's a lot of brands out there, and they're more geared towards catching fish. And admittedly, that's why we all go fishing, is to catch fish. And I understand that. And so where we try to capture that space a little bit is, instead of being a brand that kind of is about catching fish, instead let's be a brand for the fish, because if the fish didn't exist, everything else wouldn't either. And so we try to be a little bit of that voice. We try to provide them a little bit of a, I guess a voice to folks, whoever would listen. And I think it's really the anglers that participate that to some extent need to listen, because we love this fishery, whether you're a meat hauler or whether you're a conservationist or a catch and release only guy. At the end of the day, the core of all three of those subgroups is the fish itself. And so we just try to basically be a brand for trophy speckled trout. But Speckled Truth is, there's a lot of truth throughout life. And so patience, ingenuity, diligence and hard work and perseverance and all these different things. There's so many life qualities that you experience actually in a single trip targeting big trout, because they force you to be diligent. They force you to be and think outside the box and all these different things. And so we try to basically bridge that gap and show that there's so many life lessons to be learned from targeting a fish. And if you just listen enough and immerse yourself in those surroundings enough, you'll hear them.
Yes. Right on. Yeah. And that's why I asked, I don't normally ask this question, but I knew enough about, when I talk to you and I, follow you and listen to your podcast, the passion and the mission of the Speckled Truth, it just is in every word, every podcast, and it is consistent. And it speaks to all of us in some way. And just what you shared, we talked about, you mentioned conservation. I listened to the podcast with you and the president of the CCA.
Yep.
And I listened to it twice because it was so powerful. And I recommend anyone who's listening, check out all of the podcasts, but that one particularly was really powerful in what was talked about and what was shared. Yeah. And, specifically talking about conservation, because that is really important to us. And I love what the president of CCA had to say about a lot of this in it. He talked about being a good steward. He talked about, how we need to protect it and respect the resource. And this is not just for anybody. It's really all of us. It's all of our responsibility to do this, whether you're catch and release, whether you're harvesting, whoever you are, whatever you're doing. But the idea of conservation, I love that. So can you share with us, particularly in that podcast, but just who you are speaks to this. What does conservation mean to you in the sense of being a good steward of the resource, and some of the other things that I mentioned in the agenda to you?
Sure. So Pat Murray, wow, awesome guy. And to give you an idea, he drove from Houston to my house. This is the
Wow.
CCA national president, right? And just that's the level to some extent that the level of humility he has, right? He certainly didn't have to do that. But it was awesome because I got a chance to look at him in the eyes. And I think one of the things that he said during that podcast, I shared that was perpetual occasions for hope. That's what fishing is.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful.
Beautiful.
Right. And it is, it's true, right? Every time you launch a boat, every time you make a cast, it's a perpetual occasion for hope. And so, in terms of conservation, we want to preserve that. Right. And so, we love the resource so much is that we want to ensure its longevity. I want to ensure my three boys that are right outside this door, have a chance to experience and enjoy that just like I did when I was a young kid. And that goes for everybody. And so conservation in and of itself isn't a pro catch and release mindset. It's a responsible take what you need and release the rest. That's our motto. We're not, of course we advocate and catch and release, but we're not like pro catch and like all the time catch and release. Instead, hey, if you want to harvest some fish, do that. And that's important because if you have participants in the fishery taking from a resource to some extent within reason, that is active participation. And without active participants in a fishery, then we will lose that. We'll lose that right because people will take it away from us. And that's what Pat was trying to say in that podcast, was that we need people out there. We want them fishing. We want them harvesting fish, again, within reason. But we want people, we want families, we want this next generation of anglers and their next generation of anglers participating in this fishery, because this and that fishery will long outlast me and all of us here if we take care of it the right way. And that's the intent.
Yeah,
sure.
I think I actually heard Release Over 20 the first time on your podcast, Mr. Bush. And it's really cool to see that, I hear that all the way up here in Maryland now. And this, particular show really warms my heart because I'm looking at questions rolling in. Yeah. We have people chiming in from Florida, from North Carolina, Wisconsin, Maryland, Virginia, Texas. So, this message that you're sharing with the Speckled Truth is being heard.
So powerful.
Yeah. And that's not us, admittedly. I mean, Dave's done a hell of a lot better job than we'll ever do with Release Over 20. And I got to give him credit for that because, he's taken, at least a very practical approach and kind of set that and certainly something that people can kind of get behind. We don't necessarily have that. We just try to, show that through action. Right. In talking about it. But he's actually kind of put, horsepower behind the idea, which has been great. And that's far exceeded not only just the trout fishery, but, it's transcended across myriads of fisheries. Right. I mean, from black drum to redfish to, I think, flounder and sheep's head or whatever it is that he's got. And so, but I want to stay back to my core love, and that'll never deviate, and that is trophy trout and trout in general. And so it would be a disservice to everyone else of seeking and pushing other. I just don't have a passion for those types of fisheries. I told you on the stage last night, if speckled trout didn't exist, I don't think I'd even like fishing.
Wow.
Yeah. Right
wow, that's
stay true to yourself. Right on.
I honestly think I'd probably be a better fisherman if I would just focus on one fish. I'm out there trying to catch them all, and sometimes I'm like, ladies, am I actually good at fishing?
Thank you so much. That was just we're just really blessed by all that you shared. Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of these amazing fish.
Yes.
that you share with me. And if I've already shared some of these pictures twice, I apologize. But I mean, these are just some beautiful.
Oh, he's wade fishing. We're gonna get to that. I can't wait.
Oh yeah,
I love wade fishing.
That's
so cool.
I want to really target that.
That was my 4:30 right there. That my son was with me on that trip.
Aw,
that's amazing. Just
that's
oh my goodness.
That's the biggest trout my dad's ever caught.
That's your dad.
That's awesome.
Oh, that's so precious.
So let's talk about that for a second, and in conservation, and our take on conservation at the Fishing Channel is very similar to yours.
Oh, very, yeah.
We really want to rally and be cheerleaders and supporters of topics and issues that fishermen and anglers and can rally around.
Yeah.
Not focus on the things that we can get divisive about.
Exactly.
And cause drama, which we've all seen in fisheries.
Yeah, we don't do that.
But focus on the things that we can all agree on. But not to get on too much of a negative slant, but having listened to your podcast, I've heard you talk about some of the differences and changes that you've seen in that Louisiana, Texas estuary. Particularly, you talked a lot about Baffin Bay and the changes that you've seen. Can we discuss that just for a little bit?
Admittedly, I've fished Baffin in not just Baffin, but really the Texas coast for, let's see, let me calculate this. This is South Louisiana math here. So I'm going to say 7 years. So I am in no way, shape, or form the best an expert in terms of Baffin's changes. Now, what I will say is this, understanding in just the short time that I have fished it, you have seen some changes, right? And I have seen differences in angler participation, in it being a lot more socially acceptable to kind of catch and release and have kind of that take what you need and release or rest mentality, which is good. But I've had the insane and so fortunate opportunity to talk to like Cliff Webb, or Captain Cliff Webb, Mike Blackwood, who held the Texas state record for 30 years, and they fished the Baffin complex and the Laguna Madre complex. Oh my gosh, I mean, their heyday was in the 90s, but they fished it in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I can't even imagine. And so if this puts anything in perspective, both Mike Blackwood as well as Cliff Webb, two quick things. So Mike Blackwood, when I was at his house, I not only held his state record speckled trout, which was a skin mount, which was 13.3, if I remember right. And so he caught that fish in Baffin, and he also had a jar of otoliths, which are ear bones from speckled trout, and it was about halfway full. It was probably a jar about this big, a little mason jar, and it was about this big, which is probably about 4 or 5 inches tall. You get the idea, but it was halfway full of trout ear bones that were from 30-inch trout. So let's say probably 100 or more.
Wow.
Yeah. And in the story that Cliff Webb shared in his podcast and he has the actual stringer mount, which is a skin mount of the actual stringer, but it was 10 10-pounders he caught in a single day, all from the Baffin complex. And so now I've caught 5 in 7 years of fishing, and that's something to be celebrated. But if you get an understanding in terms of context, that's really pales in comparison to what those guys were and potentially where that fishery is headed. And I'm not saying it's in a bad state in any way, shape, or form. Right. But what I'm saying is that was normal. And how do we get back to normal? So
yeah. I mean, as you're saying this, and again, I'm going to go back. People are chiming in from New Jersey now. If you're chiming in from another state that I haven't named, please share. Yeah. But what you're saying, it really resonates and rings true with the striped bass fishery that we're seeing, on the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic region. Is the heyday has passed, and and it's easy to look back and say, why did you people catch so many fish? But
Sure.
you know, that was it didn't occur to anyone then to conserve.
Right.
It seemed like a renewable resource almost. But we're seeing the same thing in the Maryland region in terms of the quality of fish has gone down significantly. And I've only fished this area similar to you, the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And I've seen, some pretty significant changes.
Yeah, but so to Cliff's point, right? He's got literally a skin mount of 10-pound fish on a stringer that he caught in a single day. Think about that. And this is a man who's on my podcast, a little bit more mature and an aging angler, and still active in the guide industry down here, pleading for people to release these fish, right? And I think it speaks to the mindset change, and hopefully we get to that pendulum swing where we start to see the fishery resort back to that, where you can catch a 30. That's the expectation every single trip in the Baffin complex. Oh my gosh, I mean, we'd have guides sold out and booked, from every single day through the winter wading season, because that shot doesn't exist. And if you bring that back, the financial, facets to all that would be amazing. But aside from that, wow, what a resource. I can't even imagine. I mean, Cliff had shared too, being on the King Ranch shoreline, and the water would be black from these big schools of big trout, and I can't even imagine that, but the sad reality is I'm 41, about to be 42 years old. What he's talking, it was well within my lifetime. And that's the sadness of it. But okay, if we took it away in a lifetime to some extent, let's get it back, right? In a lifetime. And how do we do that? Right. And so I think it's a very small step in self-sacrifice, small as it may be, to just, again, make sure that we have, proper water clarity or water quality. But aside from that, like just giving back to a resource,
Yes.
So in however you can do that, right? From picking up your trash to, again, if you catch a bunch of trout, just release maybe half of them or 3/4 of them or whatever it is. And so we're just, that mindset and that level of discussion, I don't think pre-existed. And so the fact that we're having this conversation now, I think, is important.
Yeah, no, I agree. One thing, again, going back to that podcast really quick, the gentleman, I don't know if it was you or the gentleman from the CCA. I think it was the gentleman from the CCA. He said the importance of being the part of that's good of being an angler is being a good conservationist and a good steward of the resource. He also mentioned the importance of self-awareness, the desire to learn, seeing fishing as an art, because then you will have a desire not just for fishing but for the fishery. And when you and I talked, Chris, I talked about my experience with CCA, DNR, and really it just opened my eyes to the fact that, one, we may be passionate about individual fish, but we have to remember it's an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Right. So one fish isn't entirely by itself, only relying on one thing that we can change. We have to consider it as a holistic. And I think you mentioned this in the podcast, looking at things more holistically. But like you said, even simply, what can we do individually as anglers in smaller steps?
Yeah.
And, I think it's one, like the gentleman said from the president from CCA said, awareness is huge.
Yeah.
So educate yourself. And that's what we try to promote here on the show. And you do on your podcast as well. But there's just so much more at stake involving the fishery as an ecosystem as a whole, to the whales on Ocean City, to the small perch, in the Potomac. We all impact each other, and we need to be more aware of these things. So thank you for sharing that. It's very
important. Of course. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because big trout eat mullet, big trout eat croaker, big trout eat lizardfish, needlefish, and everything in between, right? And then obviously larger fish eat trout, and kind of, the cycle of life and the food chain, if you will.
Yes.
And so, but all those work in a symbiotic relationship. And so if you throw that a little bit off kilter, it obviously the give and take is from one or the other, right? And so, yeah, of course, we want to take care of trout and ensure that they're there. But if we have and see a decline in black drum or even redfish, for God's sakes,
Yeah.
as much as I love those things, and I use that kind of tongue in cheek, people know I don't particularly care for redfish a lot, but no, again, at the end of the day, is we really want a healthy fishery, and things that we can do to ensure that that's the case is going to be felt in a resounding success across whatever fish that you're pursuing.
All right. Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, let's get to some questions.
Yeah,
here.
I have a lot of questions that you brought to the tip of my tongue, but we've got a lot of questions coming in from the audience, and I want to make sure we get to as many of those as we can. Let's go back a ways.
Oh, we got a lot.
Yeah.
I think we need to have like part 2 of this here.
Colin with Big Yacker Fishing says, is there anything special about speckled trout when it comes to catch and release survivability, i.e. special handling? And remember, if we haven't told you already, Chris, you are selecting question of the night.
Yes.
So
okay. So let me address this question because it's amazing.
It's a good
fantastic question. And so I invite you to go back to the podcast that I did with Dr. Greg Stuns. Really go to after the commercial. So it's like 29 minutes in, because we talk about the science of catch and release. And Dr. Greg Stuns did a 10-year study for geotagging, basically implanting these geotags into trout, and then basically seeing how they go throughout the fishery. And then he also did a controlled study inside the hatchery as well with some of these fish that have been handled. And he did pretty much everything you can conceivably do with trout. And that was, wiping a slime coat off of them, anything from fighting them really long in really warm water. And it was really just to, again, try to understand what are the limits of these fish. And what he found throughout that entire course of study, and again, all the fish that were kind of, tagged and released and kind of meandering through the Laguna Madre and the Texas waters here, is about 90% of trout that were handled, tagged, and released, and even had been through all those handling procedures and mishandling procedures and things of that nature. 90% of them actually survived. So then Wayne Davis, who was also on the podcast, asked the question, well, was the 10%? The 10% is Dr. Greg Stuns, basically in a very Cliff Notes version, said pretty much anything gill trauma related, i.e. fingers in gills. If you hook a fish in the gills and they're bleeding profusely, if you hook them in the throat and you have where you de-hooking a fish and you pull out a gill rake or something like, he's like, that's almost a death sentence for every fish. And so that gets back to sustainable and responsible harvest. Like, I know now through study that if I hook a fish that way, I know that probably chances of survival are pretty minimal. And so I'll harvest that fish if it's well within, the legal limit. But the point there is not to say that you should mishandle all these fish. It's to say that their gills are so sensitive to their survivability that he encourages, and you'll see me in a lot of those pictures that you were showing, was holding a fish with a boga grip, which is basically, again, a latch that goes onto their mouth, and in supporting the belly of the fish. That's the proper way to tip it. Yeah, like my pops is doing. Just like that. And in short, ensuring that you're not like that. So that I took a picture. He did mention, though, straight up and down, if you're taking a quick picture, is okay. If you do that for any length of time, it's really going to hurt that fish. But in that way, like that picture there, is the proper handling procedure. I've also had Angelo Cepedos, who's the Mississippi Gulf Coast Research Lab trout hatchery manager. And he also advocated for, if you're going to handle these fish from a catch and release perspective, to try to keep that fish in the water as much as you possibly can. So if you're wade fishing and you net a fish, obviously if you net that fish, try to keep a portion of that fish in the actual water, one, to help support the body weight of the fish itself, but also two, to help protect that slime coat. And then lastly, if you're in a boat and you net a fish and you pull them out the water, de-hook that fish, and before you release, kind of keep them in the water in the net to kind of get them kind of self-aware again, and then off they go. So, but those two podcasts were insanely insightful, and I got so much feedback for people that were into catch and release. And when you have a doctor, a scientist who's studied this and a decade-long study of very extensive research and published papers on it, basically say that catch and release for speckled trout, 90% of them survive, and the 10% that don't have gill trauma.
Okay. Wow,
that's really
valuable
cool
information.
Something that I learned on your show that I've actually shared with a lot of people in my area is if you catch a trout that are, some of the sizes of the ones that you've shown, upper 20s to 30s, those are fish at the end of their life cycle.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah. I think where I'm going with this, because you said it on your podcast. But that, it brings up an interesting dilemma, right? When you're releasing a 30+ inch fish with its chances of survival, right?
Yeah, for me though, this goes back to maybe the more emotional, sensitive part to this is that, in the words of Jay Watkins, that'll probably be the last time I'll ever have a chance to catch that fish, right? And for that brief moment in time, we had a chance to share that experience. And so to that end, that fish who's 29, 30, let's say 30 and change, if I catch that fish, I'm going to do everything I can to release that fish. And not because it may not be, profitable for, spawning or whatever it is, because it is at the end of its life cycle. That fish has deserved the right to live.
Yes.
So out of respect for the fish and the fishery, that's why they get my nods release. But really, to Angelos's point, if you're looking to be a better steward of a fishery, really the fish that you really want to truly catch and release are really those kind of 19 to 23 inch range, because those are still have the highest population ish in the fishery. And also too, they're the way it was equated to me is like they're like teenagers and young adults. They want to get after it, right? And so let them go. And there's more of them, and so let them. So if we can fence off a little bit, or at least reduce harvest of that particular year class of fish, that's going to have sustainable benefit for the fishery itself. But for those larger fish, it's not necessarily for ROI, return on investment, but more so for out of respect for that fish.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
I like what you said about keeping fish in the water longer. We had another captain on the show who talked about that, but that kind of segues into a question that we both had, because we love different styles of fishing. We try to bring this forefront. So this is good. And
ever since I've listened to the Speckled Truth, I've always kind of tried to wrap my head around this. In this region, in the Chesapeake region, targeting speckled trout usually comes from a boat. Sometimes people do it from shore, but we don't have the vast flats that you guys have where you can just wade.
I love it.
And help me understand this. Like, you get to a place where you wade, but how do you get there? You don't just walk into the water from anywhere and just go for control, do you?
No, so actually, admittedly, here in Texas, you can walk in. There's a lot of walk-in wade spots. Laguna Madres, I mean, you can. There's miles of flats that you can not own a boat and wade. I have a little solo skiff. I debated whether or not I should have. I've owned a bazillion boats in my life, and so living here in San Antonio, it's about 3 hours to the coast. And so realistically, if I fish 10 times a month, oh my God, my wife is like, okay, you're done. But the point is that's a lot of wear and tear on a trailer and things of that nature. And really, I typically fish by myself, so I don't need anything fancy. And I mostly wade fish, so it's really a taxi for me, a very wet taxi. I'll say that. But the short of it is there's so many flats here, and the reason wade fishing I think is probably so popular here is, one, because you can do it in pretty much every fishery. There's so many flats to wade, but I think the probably tangible that isn't necessarily socialized is that when you are wade fishing and being immersed in the environment, and this is why I like wade fishing. When you're immersed in the environment, I can tell you through my waders that there's a water temperature change
Yeah.
from spot to spot. I can slip in a spot and then
that's
slip
cool.
out and come into another spot. And I'm like, yeah, the water's a little bit colder back here.
Yeah.
I can also feel bottom contour. I can go, okay, well, I came up on a little tabletop or a little ridge. I can also tell you bottom texture, right? I can tell you that it went from like maybe a hard sand to all of a sudden I'm feeling a little bit of that soft shell, maybe some grass mixed in there. And then also when you start catching, fish or getting bites, that's just another piece to that puzzle.
Yeah.
And that's something you truly, you can see it on electronics, but you can't feel it.
Yes.
And I know for the sake of time, this was very relevant about 2 weeks ago. And I shared this in the last discussion that I had when I did at FTU, the presentation in December. And it was actually fishing on it with a jerkbait. And it was a tougher day. It was a very slow bite. And it wasn't until I finally figured it out. And it was through a very series of clues. But the way in which this bite came to be was I was basically fishing what I felt was deeper structure. So again, I would be fishing shallower structure, but with such clear water, I was targeting deeper. And what happened is that through other spots that I was going to, I was understanding that those fish were relating to that. And so I knew a spot had like basically a little bitty underwater kind of point that kind of came back tight to the shoreline with a deep drop close by. And so I wanted to wade straight to that point, that underwater point. And on the backside of that point was a little bit more kind of sand shell. And it was a pretty notable drop, right? It went from pretty much like belly deep to like, chest deep. So I knew that there was a significant contour change there. But what I didn't know, and I've waded this spot a lot and I just didn't pay attention to it, was on that little point, there was another kind of super subtle point that just went right off the end of it. And I was wading about actually less than waist deep, so less than my belt. And so as I was working through that flat, I got shallower. I was like now thigh deep. And all of a sudden I came off the other side of it and I was back to about belly deep. Well, I had caught 3 fish and missed another right where that elbow came up, but I didn't know how far out it went. And so I kind of kept going as far as I could. And long story short, until you pay attention to those subtleties, that's the clue that sometimes will lead to a successful or an unsuccessful trip to a successful trip. And so the fish were actually, and if you can see this, that's my 11, that's an 11 pounder, but this is actually a 6 cents 106X provoke jerkbait. These fish wanted it a certain way as well. So they were postured deeper on structure. They wanted that bait banging in the bottom and then slow floating off. If you fished above them, they weren't touching it. So they were on a subtle point and then on the bottom. And until you piece that together, and that's what wade fishing can do, is it allows you to pick apart all that stuff.
Yes, I love it. I
Chris,
love wade fishing. I did it in the mountains of Virginia my first time. Oh,
I've got so many
beautiful.
questions.
We talk about so much.
Because
oh my gosh.
Speckled truth are like, I can't tell you my other favorite fish. You and I might argue on that one. But I've got so many questions, and it's forcing me to live by my words, because these are personal questions for selfish reasons.
Well, we got an audience that
and
has
we have
tons of
a lot of questions coming in from the audience. So I'm gonna put mine aside, and
we can always ask Chris another.
Shanna Marcus Fishing. If you could choose, what is your ideal temperature for targeting large trout during the fall? Is there a range that seems to be the money zone?
Yeah, for fall, let's say in the low 60s, 60 to 65 is really my targeted temperature. When that hits 60 to 65, it's on like pecan, as we would say down here. Or pecan, I don't know however you say it, but I'm from South Louisiana, so I don't say anything right most of the time. So yeah, 60 to 65. That's a good question though.
That's good, yeah.
From Southwest Florida.
Oh, okay. So Cape Coral Jupiter Kayak Fishing, our boy E, who's also a correspondent on the Fishing Channel Plus.
Yeah.
What depth, tackle, and time of season that you found those 30-inch trout?
Yeah, pretty much from So I'll go number one. Number one was April 19th. In That was caught in a top water. And then I'll go number two was a 31-inch fish that I caught on also in April. That was April 12th on a key lime gambler flapping shad. Number three was a 32.5-inch fish that I caught on December 10th. That was on a jerk bait. And then number four was a summer fish. That was one that I'd mentioned. I was caught in a Ned rig. Dead of summer is actually 1 September.
My favorite.
I caught that in one of the photos, and I was like, "Is that a Ned rig?"
I love the Ned rig.
Yeah.
And then the last one I caught was a 31-inch fish, a little over 9. That was also caught in a jerkbait on January 1st of 2022.
Happy New Year to
So
right?
What that showcases is that there is no magical time. And in addition to that, we also do a trophy trout citation program where we actually study, and we have about 1,000 data entries from 27-inch trout caught across various states. And we basically pull all those together. We've done moon phase studies. We've done lunar age studies. We've done majors and minors and how they relate to solunar and all the different feeding periods, the time of month, like you name it. We've pretty much done that. And there are moon phases that are a little bit more predictable, i.e. pre-new moon is actually, I think, the highest, if I remember right. And then also the day of the full moon actually happens to be the second best day, and the most citations we've ever had registered is on that particular day. But also, the other thing to that is that we've had fish registered across the spectrum on days, lunar age, lunar, moon phase, blah, 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 you name it. And so it also speaks to there's really no magical time. And it also is true to the old adage, you can't catch them on the couch. So you have to be out there, and you never know, it might happen.
Got to go be the report.
That's true.
Chris, we're coming up on like 2 minutes left. Are you okay if we go a few minutes extra to take some of these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this stuff.
Next question coming in from Robert Lombardi with Current Break Kayak Fishing. He's Virginia.
All right. Are you taking it?
No, it's all
okay.
good.
All right. My personal best spec is 28 inches on the popping court. Still looking for that 30-inch. Is there a common thread as far as technique, bait, presentation, etc., that is common for the larger fish?
No, the common thing that we've seen across all spectrums of bigger fish, and this is based on the citation data, is that really soft plastics have kind of reigned supreme, mainly because that could be due to angler experience, right? I mean, most people are pretty comfortable throwing soft plastics. I myself have caught more larger fish on hard baits and jerk baits and Paul Brown corkies and things of that nature. I've rarely, actually, one of my 30s was on a soft play, actually two, the Ned rig as well. But I've caught far fewer fish on a soft plastic presentation than I have on, again, a top water to a jerk bait or whatever it is. But taking mine aside, most of the bigger fish that have been registered have typically come on a soft plastic. Number two actually has actually been a top water bait. We've also done it by state, right? And so across the spectrum, across states, top water has obviously been a pretty high producer. Again, number two. But here in Texas, actually, number one was a Paul Brown corky. Surprise, surprise. And again, is that angler tendency, or is that because the fishery fishes shallower and that's what's left in the bait? We don't know, right? These are all the things that we're kind of trying to kind of look into. But yeah, we are that nerdy, and we take it to that extreme. But to answer the question, first off, congrats on a 28-inch trout. It's amazing fish. But aside from that,
you beat by an inch.
Robert's amazing angler.
Popping court. That's awesome. But the thing there is, you just use what you can, fish when you can, and pretty much most techniques are are suitable for catching large trout. Some are better than others.
I think my personal best came on a Z-Man, on a GI jig, which is a jig manufacturer that sponsors us, but super popular in this region. But I'm with you. My confidence bait's going to be like a 3 to 4 inch jerk bait.
Top water.
Jerk bait. I don't know what it is. I just feel more connected to my lure when I'm fishing a jerk bait. It's just one of those things that works for me. Question. Actually, the guy that taught me the most about specs in this area is Walleye Pete.
Yes.
And he's the one that really turned me on to clear water in this region. But he asked, are the specs in your region 12 months, or do they migrate at all?
Yeah, they're in our region 12 months. It's 12 months of a year fishery, 100%. If they do migrate, it's very, very small distances within the actual fishery. Again, going back to that podcast with Dr. Greg Stunz, through that fishery, and again with the geotagging data, he did realize that those trout that he did tag, most would say that they would probably be loners and kind of homestead in certain areas, because we don't have a lot of tide in our fishery. But what he found is through that study is that most of the trout that he tagged and released swam up to 12 miles a day. So they move, even whether that they have a reason to or not, but they do move quite a bit. But our fishery down here in South Texas is a 12-month year fishery, 100%.
Awesome. What else do we got going on here? Oh, okay, Scott. What are your sources and method for pre-trip planning, an area you have never fished?
Sure.
Great questions tonight, guys. Good
That's a good one. Man, I wrote an article back, oh my gosh, in like 2015. And it was after some of the bigger fish that I caught in Mississippi and the Biloxi Gulf Coast, Mississippi Gulf Coast in Biloxi. And I called it, it's titled Go Big. And so I'm a huge proponent of big structure. And so the pre-trip planning to that is understanding what that big structure is, whether it's a main, it's a main shoreline point, whether or not you got a big drain or, some sort of water intake or output to that flat. Again, kind of looking at grass. I know Salt Strong does a lot of that stuff. For me, it's really just looking at a lot of that bigger structure that's relevant to that shoreline. The pre-trip planning then rolls into, okay, I'm going to have a series of confidence baits. I'm going to try to pick that area apart and just try to, get bit. And so when I'm looking at a new area, I hate to say this, but to some extent, it almost feels like a sixth sense. You can kind of feel bait presence is there. But I also know there might be a back lake, right? That might have a little bit of a, we call them trenasses, or a little bayou or a little cut coming from that back lake in. And depending on wind direction, water could be blowing in or out of that. And so as I progress through that flat, or as I work through that, am I understanding that, the bottom contour is staying relatively flat? It looks like it is. Maybe I see on Google Maps that there's maybe it looks to be a little drop or a raise up there. All these different things. And then you just let your mind wander and you go explore.
Yes.
And then you try different myriad of techniques. But really the pre-trip planning is like just having the confidence to know what baits that are probably going to be suitable for you and your fishing style in that particular area. And then applying that with confidence. And then if it falls flat, then abort, go to a new area. But I definitely like bigger structure. Again, a drain out, a big main point. If you see some rock structure, maybe some man-made structure, anything along those lines, I've found like a lot of those larger fish, jetties were huge in the Mississippi Gulf Coast. A lot of the casinos that were there, right? They had all this kind of man-made structure in this kind of, nowhere coast, right? That didn't have a lot of contour change. Well, that was the actual structure. And so to live in that environment, you got to be pretty rugged, you got to be pretty raw, and you got to be pretty big. And so that's where I focus a lot of my efforts. But even here, I don't focus on tight potholes and little grass flats that have I'm just not that good of a fisherman, because I know it doesn't suit my style. And that's where I get back to have the confidence to throw what you have confidence in. But I know that I like to power fish a lot and then pick apart. And then once I get one bite then I'll start dialing it in from there.
Yeah.
And that's either, and I've used that analogy too. I'll either go from top to bottom. So I'll throw a top water or a double D, working high up in the surface, to then going all the way down to soft plastics. And I'll work that entire flat with that myriad of techniques. And then if something's productive, then I'll basically start pimping that. And then whether the fish size increases or not, that's going to dictate whether or not I stay or not.
Yeah, it's funny what you said. Once you get a bite, you start dialing it in. It's something I've always said about fishing. It's something that's very difficult to get better with, to learn from failure. If you're not getting bites, it's hard to establish a pattern. Fritz asks, he says, so if you deep hook a speck in gill area, is it better to cut the lure off and give the fish a chance to rust the hook off?
Yeah. So again, I'll invite you to go back and talk to that, because Dr. Greg Stuns actually mentioned that specific case. He basically had said you can even cut the hook and all that stuff. We saw mortality rates still high in those fish. So again, if there's any sort of blunt gill trauma to that, it's typically best to harvest that fish. And specific to that, cutting your lure off and then releasing that fish and let it rust out. If that was a case and there was gill trauma involved, that fish definitely died, or more often than not died in their control study.
Got it. Victor says, okay, it's not a touch screen. My laptop's not.
Is that a question?
Yeah. Hey, everyone, this is amazing. Thank you all for doing this live, guys. Check out Speckled Truths. We're going to get to that in a second. And subscribe to us on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. We have one last question, and then we're going to get to question of the night and let this man
Get back
and
to
his family enjoy the rest of their evening. But
I got this.
Darn it, man.
Yeah, darn it. Thank you. I was going to say that because we don't curse show. How about fly fishing? Do you do any? If so, what are fly patterns and sizes and colors?
But I will encourage that angler, if they don't already know, but there's a Dr. J. Wright in Kissimmee, Florida. And so he owns 3 IGFA certified world records in line classes for speckled trout. And if you think I'm nerdy, and he was actually on the podcast as well, Dr. J. Wright, that man solely targets big trout on fly. And he mostly does that through blind casting, believe it or not. And so he's obviously perfected his craft, and he throws a lot of smaller patterns. But if you don't follow him, you need to, and mainly because he shares some of that through his social media. I don't think he has a super strong presence, but the point there is, and if you haven't, reach out to him. You talk about an insanely humble person who loves to share his knowledge of targeting big fish, specifically on fly. I totally encourage you to befriend that man and know him and follow him. And so again, Doc J. Wright out of Florida.
We're writing this down here.
Is it Jay?
It is.
And WRIGHT.
WRIGHT. Yep.
Okay.
Right. Tony has it. You want to do one more question?
Are you okay? We'll ask our
speakers. Are you okay with one more question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, we'll keep going. I don't care.
Last question, and then we will go to question of the night.
Of course.
Tony Fernandez asks, in reference to harvesting a gill-hooked fish, is there any leniency from the game warden when in possession of an undersized gill-hooked fish? I think I know the answer to that one. Assuming the leader is cut long enough to be visible, or the lure is visible and obviously gut hooked. Okay. Always been worried about this.
From personal experience, and it sucks to say that, but if I hook a fish that's underneath the legal limit or legal size limit, I'm throwing it back. And I hate to do that. But I, especially, preaching conservation, and I know that's kind of seems counterintuitive as well, but also I'm in the Air Force. I like to follow rules.
Yeah.
And so, if that's what the state is, and it's, I think now it's 17 to 23 inches. Yeah. If I catch a 15-inch trout and there's just like a lot of gill trauma,
Yeah.
I will release that fish. Is yeah, as much as that sucks, but I would hate to be caught with
Yeah.
that fish,
Oh,
especially harvesting it, especially given Speckled Truth, man. I can only imagine like, oh yeah, I got a ticket for keeping an undersized
yeah.
trout. So I don't know. I mean, I would throw it back personally.
Yeah. I love that integrity call,
Yeah.
for sure. And it's also, you mentioned you're representing not just yourself, your brand and what you put out. And I discuss this with Grant all the time about our show. It is about, we have to make integrity calls if we're representing ourselves and our brand.
Yeah.
And it's not always fun or pretty, but we have to do it. It's who we are.
And I think it also brings up another, valuable point here is that, our job as anglers in terms of our regulations is to follow the regulations that have been put in place by the people we've elected to make those decisions.
Right on.
And I think so often anglers get into, get angry at each other when really, if you've got a problem with it, the real issue is with your lawmakers and the people that are making regulations. So
yeah, good questions. All right, so we are rounding up to question of the evening. This is exciting. Here we go.
A drum roll.
Do I choose it? Is that right?
You're choosing on drum roll to give you plenty of time.
We can.
I like the 28-inch trout question on a pop and cork. I can't remember who had mentioned
it was Robert Lombardi.
Oh, Robert Lombardi.
That's good.
Yeah, an amazing kayak angler in this area.
Current break kayak fishing. My personal best spec is 28 inches on a pop and cork. Still looking for that 30. Is there a common thread as far as technique, bait, presentation, etc.?
Yay.
Robert, you are the winner of the prize of the night. And the prize of the night, one more time, Chris, is what?
It's based. I wish I had it. I didn't have enough time. But anyway, it's a box that we have. Speckled Truth. You'll see it. But again, it'll be a myriad of different lures from different lure manufacturers, particularly here in the Texas coast.
Awesome.
Well, that's Chris, thank you so much for being so generous of your time.
For sure.
I know we went over a lot, but it was really cool to hear, your perspective, your knowledge, your vast knowledge, and also people chiming in from, gosh, there must have been 12 or 13 states tonight from your area all the way up to New Jersey. So that's really cool.
So, again, we don't assume that everyone who's watching knows who our guests are, but how can people follow you? Because just the amazing amount of wealth of knowledge we can't even squeeze into an hour. How can they follow you? Are you on social media? Can you share with the audience how to follow you?
Sure. So first off, I appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. It really is humbling, and I appreciate the kind words. And if I don't have a chance, I just want to say that, but also to really just enjoy the love of this and sharing whatever I've seen and knowledgeable, if it is or isn't. It's really just a matter of thought. And so I like to share that. And again, going back to, I think the comment you had made, Anastasia, which was bringing more sport to sport fishing. That's what, Dr. or Mr. Pat Murray had mentioned. But also, one of my mentors, Captain Mike McBride, I always kind of, mention to him, we want to encourage, bringing sport back into sport fishing. And what better way to do that than unleash your imagination and get after it. And so again, the Speckled Truth and all these techniques and the information that we have in Garner and all that stuff is really just a labor of love, really to unleash the imagination in hopes that folks can capture and catch and release hopefully a large fish that they're after. Right. So, but for following us, we do an absolutely abysmal job, but Instagram as well as Facebook, those are our two social media outlets. And that's all I have time for. Yeah. But if you do message us, if you do comment and things of that nature, or if you do buy a shirt, right, we do have, our website and all that stuff. I'd be remiss to actually say that because that's where actually a lot of my old articles are that started this whole thing. And so, but all that stuff is anything Speckled Truth related. Typically, you're interfacing with me from your customer complaint department, your shipping department, your content creation. So, but yeah, Instagram, Facebook, as well as the website. And I do have some awesome guys that help as well. Captain Kyle Johnson, Edward Crum, Keith Morrison, Robert Hoyt. Those are really the support system that we have here at Speckled Truth. But these are all fathers, right, and husbands and guys who are devoted to the integrity of fishing, and aside from that, to their families. And so anyway, that's what we are, and that's who we are at. And so if you interface with us, we'll respond back to you, and if not, that's on us, because out of respect for you and your time submitting a question or a comment, we owe you that respect and responding back to you. So anyway, I know that's long-winded. I do talk a lot.
You have the only fishing podcast that I've ever listened to that's caused me to shed a tear.
Seriously,
you told a story about a magazine editor. And excuse me if I'm messing it up. A woman magazine editor in Louisiana. That was a really touching story, and you really could feel your emotion through the speakers. And that was just a really touching moment. And what you put on it, the Speckled Truth, is just a really quality production. And I just wanted to let you know how much we appreciate it.
Right on. And everything that you shared, I think I had goosebumps this entire show. I'm actually going to watch this replay. But the way you describe your experience of fishing and how you share it, I know it comes from a really deep place in your heart, but it is poetry. I think I could think of one other person that we have on the show, Cambo Trout, who speaks very passionately, but there's just such heart in what you do, and so much depth and genuine desire for people to gain knowledge. And we appreciate you so much for what you do, because like I always say, it totally transcends the rod. So thank you for what you do, and you do a great job at it.
Thanks, Anastasia. I really appreciate it, guys, and all the kind words and support. It definitely does come from that place. And again, the relationships throughout the entirety of this is really, I think, at the end of it, really, I think what we'll cherish the most. The fish is kind of merely secondary at that point, but it's interesting in that a fish kind of binds, the fishing community together, and especially the speckled trout fishery and large trout fishery to some extent, because we're kind of sickos or something. But the point there is, man alive, the relationships we've had and created and developed is awesome. And so I think, I'm sorry, last thing, having these guys on the podcast, like the Jay Watkins and the Cliff Webbs and Blackwoods, and Paul Brown was on the podcast, and Bruce Baugh and Dr. You name it, right? All these legends in the game have given me some of their time, right, to share, so they can share their story. And the common thread across that is that they all share and have this deep meaning of this fishery for that, right? And so I don't take that lightly. And so as we continue with Speckled Truth, from credibility to how we interface with followers, to being a leadership example within the fishery, it's mainly to hold up their standard that they've already set as a foundation for us. And so I don't take that lightly in any way, shape, or form. We have guides on there. We have, again, legends, man, in this game, who've confided in us to share their message and share a common message. And so I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't mention that and thank them for that. But aside from that, I'm doing what I can to continue that legacy, because really, as Jay Watkins mentions, this will be the last thing, is that we're always walking in footsteps.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I don't know. I feel like my life has been changed by this show, and I'm not going to cry about it, but I'll be all right. Thank you.
Well, we are truly honored to have had you as a guest.
Such a blessing. Thank you. Oh my gosh.
This is goodbye for now, but we will definitely be in touch. And I've wanted to get down to your fishery for the longest, so it's definitely on my bucket list. But goodbye for now, but we will be in touch, and definitely continuing to listen to you through the Speckled Truth.
Yes. So everyone who tuned in, thank you so much. We really appreciate everyone who brought questions in and comments. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope everyone has an amazing night, and we'll see you again soon. So fish on, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks, Chris.
Yep.